The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we're back again. Another episode of Genesis. As always, I'm your host, Ian Kahanowitz. We got another recurring author coming back to show to talk about his wonderful book, City of Dreams, Dodger Stadium, and the birth of man Los Angeles. And yes, I'm talking about Jerald Podair. And, you know, Professor Podair, he's up in Wisconsin, so he's not really in Los Angeles. You know, he's like me. He's freezing. Now it's like 50 degrees. It's negative degrees.
Yeah,
you know,
the endless winter. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, now it's like, well, it's going to be 60 degrees. But, you know, we're joined by Professor Podair. Again, he's at Lawrence University, and he teaches history. And welcome back to the show. We got some really good news about the book. And because of this good news, it makes me feel good that this is probably about the fourth or fifth time you're coming back to the show.
Yeah, I think it's the fourth or fifth time. It's a long-running series at this point. And the good news is that my book was long-listed or semi-finalist for the PEN ESPN Award for Literary Sports Writing. And as they say, it's a great honor just to be nominated. The book is in with some really, really great books. The Cubs Way, Lee Montville's a book on Muhammad Ali. Some really great great other books, and mine's the only academic press book in the group of the semifinalists. So I'm actually very proud about that. So yeah, that was some good news.
And you know, Professor Podair, you know, it's very, very interesting because I read all kinds of sports books, and I always notice a difference between the academic books and the books written by sports writers. The sports writers just throw in major facts and all this stuff.
Right.
Whereas academics like you and me, we do deep, hard research, and we're quoting, like, you know, statutes and legal doctrines and all this stuff. And your book was so well researched, so well put together. We had finished the courts the last time. We know that the Supreme Court ruled 7-0 in favor of O'Malley. Now O'Malley's rejoicing. He's having a great time. I won. This is great. I don't have to renegotiate for anything. This is marvelous. I don't have to move the team. I can't move the team.
Right.
What's going on now? There's another hurdle.
But then there's yet another hurdle, and this hurdle might be in a way the most serious because it does involve race. It involves race and ethnicity. It does not involve the courts, okay? It doesn't involve an election, but it does involve race. And it has long-running consequences for the relationship of the Dodgers with the Latino community in Los Angeles generally. Now, this is what happens. There is, of course, as our listeners know, the Chavez Ravine area, neighborhood of Los Angeles, which we now associate, of course, with Dodger Stadium. But for many years before Dodger Stadium was built, the Chavez Ravine neighborhood was home to a Mexican-American community of long-standing, a traditional, I would say it's fair to say impoverished but stable, a Mexican-American community in the Chavez Ravine area. In the late 1940s, that area was selected as the site of a public housing project. And most of the residents of Chavez Ravine were bought out. I mean, they were evicted under eminent domain proceedings. They were paid for their homes, not what they were worth, but they were paid for their homes, and they left. In the early 1950s, that public housing project was canceled. And that is a complete different story, an interesting story, because it was basically Red Scared out of existence. It was attacked as socialist housing. These are the McCarthy years, the early 1950s. So the public housing project is canceled, but most of the Chavez Ravine residents have already left. A few, however, stay on and refuse to leave. One of the people who refused to leave is a family called the Arachiga family. The father's named Manuel and the mother Abrana. They refused to take the eminent domain money, and they refused to leave. So technically, they are squatters throughout much of the 1950s, as in the wake of the cancellation of the public housing project, Chavez Ravine is almost empty. It's not completely empty. There are a few families that are still there, just refuse to leave, and the land is empty. Now, in May 1957, Walter O'Malley flies over that land on one of his trips to Los Angeles to perhaps plan the move of the Dodgers, and he says, well, if I come here, this is where I want to build my stadium because it's virtually empty land and it is right adjacent to downtown. The city arranges, and we've talked about this earlier, once O'Malley makes the decision to come to L.A., to get him that land, basically, in a land swap for Wrigley Field elsewhere in the city and other considerations. O'Malley and the Dodgers are to get that Chavez Ravine land. And that brings us up to 1959, to May 1959, when it's time to get started working on the stadium, grading the land, building the roads. And there are still some of these Mexican-American families who are on this Chavez Ravine land, and at this point they've been legally evicted, but they still refuse to go. And they are not going to go quietly. And the Arechiga family especially is the most vocal and becomes really the symbol of this issue. They claim they still own their homes and they should not be evicted from their homes, and there are many in Los Angeles, and not just Mexican Americans, who support them, who say that they are being treated very unfairly. Now, it comes down to the day of the scheduled evictions, and it's important to note that although the Dodgers get blamed for these evictions, they do not carry them out. When the original eviction notices were served in the early 1950s to build this public housing project and served on the Arechigas as well, as we know, the Dodgers were in Brooklyn and had nothing to do with this. It's only years later, in 1957, that the Dodgers ended up acquiring this land. So it's really the city and the county of Los Angeles that is actually performing and doing these evictions. And that's what happens on May 8th, 1959, and it's not a pretty sight. The Arechigas, knowing that the sheriff's deputies are coming, barricade themselves inside their homes. They own two homes. It's an extended family, and refuse to leave. The sheriff deputies break down the doors, go into the homes, and actually take a number of the Arechiga family out physically. One of the Arechiga daughters was basically dragged down the steps of her home with her head hitting the floorboards of the porch. It is not a pretty sight, and it is all covered, as you might imagine, by the news media. This is on television. It's covered very extensively, and it becomes a national story, this forced eviction of the Arechigas. So it is not a good day for either the Dodgers or the city or county of Los Angeles, because the Arechigas generate a tremendous amount of public sympathy. A couple of days after the evictions, they go before the Los Angeles City Council and basically make their case. Their supporters come with them to the council chambers. It's a very, very loud and boisterous atmosphere. People are being booed and shouted down. There are signs, save our homes, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a very compelling case and image that the Arechigas make. And again, not just for Mexican Americans who are obviously disturbed about these evictions on the grounds of ethnic solidarity, as we would see in with many other groups, but there are a lot of white homeowners, conservative white homeowners in the Los Angeles area who are very disturbed about this as well, because they're thinking, well, if someone who owns his home, who's owned it and paid for it, can be evicted like this, who can be thrown out, who can be given a lowball offer on an eminent domain proceeding, which they reject, which is what the Arechigas did. If they can be thrown out like this, well, what will prevent me from being thrown out of my home in the San Fernando Valley? So they generate a tremendous amount of public sympathy, but only for a period of time, because about a week or so after these evictions, the Los Angeles Mirror-News, which is one of the newspapers in the city, publishes an explosive story. The Arechigas, who, after they were evicted from their homes, set up a tent encampment across the street from their homes, which had been bulldozed, after they were evicted. They set up a tent encampment with the implication that they had nowhere to go. the Los Angeles Mirror News published a story about 5 or 6 days after this that said the Arechigas not only have a place to go, they own 11 homes. Their family owns 11 homes in the Los Angeles area. Some of those homes were very close to their homes in Chavez Ravine. And so the Arechigas were, it was an embarrassing situation because they had implied that they were destitute, they had implied they had nowhere to go, and they generated a lot of sympathy. Then it turns out that as an extended family, they own all these homes with a combined net worth of $75,000, which in 1959 was a substantial amount of money. I don't know what it translates to in our money, but it translates to a substantial amount of money. And after that, public opinion turned very sharply against the Arechigas, and unfortunately a lot of it was racialized. In other words, if the Arechigas had been white, this could have happened also, and they probably would have been criticized. But here they were not only criticized for the 11 homes, they were criticized because they were Latino. And a lot of the research that I've done in the archives consists of letters that, in the wake of the revelations of these 11 homes being owned, letters either being written to the Arechigas or to a Los Angeles city councilman named Edward Roybal, who was a Mexican American councilman who was their champion and their spokesman. Letters written to him with all sorts of racial invective, saying not only are you cheating the city, but you're a red Mexican, you're a communist Mexican, or why don't you go back to why don't you go back to Mexico? What we would sort of expect to see. So the cries of outrage that the Arechigas were not being completely forthcoming are also combined with what I would call racist sentiments as well. So what happens then is sentiment turns against the Arechigas. They lose most of their support in the white community, and the process of the stadium being built continues. The stadium ground is broken on the stadium in 1959, and it starts to take shape. But the Latino community in Los Angeles views this incident in a very different way. They view it as Mexican Americans, Latinos, being evicted from their homes by a white power structure that basically stole their land at Chavez Ravine. And the Arechigas, their legacy in the Latino community in Los Angeles, many say, is the Chicano movement itself, that this was the opening spark of what became the Chicano movement in Southern California and elsewhere in the 1960s and beyond. And even to this day, in the Los Angeles Latino community, the Arechigas are remembered. But it's complicated because, as I say at the end of my book, Latinos in Los Angeles are the best Dodger fans. So in many ways, the Latino community in Los Angeles, there's this idea that sometimes you have to be able to carry two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time. Sometimes that's defined as genius, the ability to carry two contradictory ideas in your head without apparent tension. Well, I think for the Latino community in Los Angeles, there are these two contradictory emotions. One emotion is an ongoing sense of anger over the eviction of the Arechigas and others at Chavez Ravine and that lost traditional Latino community there. The other emotion is love for the Dodgers, and the Latino community in Los Angeles, I've always felt, is the most loyal source of support for the Dodgers. Other fans come and go when the Dodgers do well or they don't do well, but the Latino community in Los Angeles sticks with the Dodgers very loyally. So you have this contradiction and this tension. In history, things are almost always not one thing or the other. You could say the Latino community has never forgiven the Dodgers for what happened to the Arechigas. Again, they didn't do it to the Dodgers. The Arechigas, the city did, but it was under the auspices of building the stadium for the Dodgers. You can say on the one hand, well, the Latino community will never forgive the Dodgers for what happened at Chavez Ravine, and to an extent they won't. But at the same time, they love the Dodgers. and they support the Dodgers. And so that's where we are. The complications of history and the paradoxes of history, I think, are illustrated very clearly here with two conflicting emotions that a community has at the same exact time. So the Arechiga incident, I think, the Arechiga evictions, of all the challenges and all the traumas, basically, for Walter O'Malley as he tried to get the stadium built, I think that may have been the worst because, of course, in America, racial tensions, racial disputes are the most bitter. You can fight about money, you can fight in the courts, but when you start fighting and it does involve race in America, it goes to another level, and I think that's what happened here.
And you know what's interesting? Before I get to Mr. Roybal over here, who was instrumental in getting Arechigas to leave, this sentiment really lasted a long time, like you said. Even today, it's still talked about. But I'm reading some of my history. It was around the end of the 70s, early 1980s, when Los Angeles eclipsed Chicago as the second biggest city, and when Fernando Mania was taking place in 1991, that's when the Latino population started to embrace the Dodgers.
Right. I think they were embracing them earlier, and largely it was because of and I'm not the best on Spanish pronunciation, but the great baseball announcer, Spanish language baseball announcer Jaime Jarrín, who Walter O'Malley hired him in his first or second year in Los Angeles in the late 50s to be a Spanish language broadcast and to do Spanish language broadcasts of Dodger games. And in the late 1950s, virtually no other teams in Major League Baseball were doing Spanish language broadcasts. It's possible that the Yankees may have been in New York, but I think that was it. And I think his last name is spelled Jarrin, and any Dodger fan, Latino or not, knows this man. He's in the Hall of Fame. He is the Vin Scully of Spanish language broadcasts, and actually he and Vin Scully broadcast Dodger games together for many years. I think it was that first captured the imagination of the Latino community in Los Angeles. And, of course, these Spanish language broadcasts are going on even as the Arechiga evictions take place. But you are right in terms of Fernando Mania. It really did cement the Latino community to the Dodgers, I think, in a very unique way. It was said about Walter O'Malley that he always had hoped that there could be some Latino Dodger star, and he didn't live to see that. But Fernando, who is still associated with the Dodgers, was that guy. So there are some, again, history is cross-cutting. There are emotions on either side, and it's very, very rare in history that, as I said, someone just slams the door on something and says, we're not going to have anything to do with you anymore because of specifically this. Now, the Arechigas never forgave the city of Los Angeles, and in terms of what happened to them, but they're the ones who were personally involved. So I think that's a little different. According to what my research, even then, their son John Arechiga, who was part of these evictions, would never go to Dodger Stadium again, according to his daughter, but he would listen to them on the radio. So again, the complexities of history.
But it's even at the very end, the Arechigas were still fighting this. And like I mentioned, we got Mr. Roybal over here who did speak Spanish. How was he instrumental in convincing the Arechigas to leave?
Well, Edward Roybal, who is, I think if you come from Los Angeles and study Los Angeles political history, that is a name that is very well known to you because Roybal had about a 40-year career in local Los Angeles politics. He was, until the early 1960s, a L.A. city councilman, and then he became a very powerful and respected congressman for the next 30 years. So he had a very long career as a councilman and a congressman. And Roybal, I think, is in a unique position and in a very difficult position during this Arechiga controversy, because it's hard for us to believe this now, but in the 1950s, Los Angeles was not a Latino city. It was a Protestant city. It was a white Protestant city with a huge number of migrants from the Midwest. They came out in the 20s and 30s and even afterwards, 40s, to work in the the defense plants. So it's not really a Latino city then. And Edward Roybal is the first Mexican-American councilman in Los Angeles, I think, in the 20th century. So he is in a very, very unique position in the 1950s as one of the very few Latino elected officials. In many ways, he's in a precarious position because of that. And Edward Roybal, who is a liberal, I mean, he's a, I think we could call him, today a big government liberal. I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I mean that in a descriptive sense. That's pretty much, where he is. But he is also a Latino, and he has to sort of balance his broader political stance with his support for the Arechigas, because many of Roybal's political allies, who are also liberals, are in favor of this stadium. But he has to, in a sense, be against it. He also is a very cautious man. He's not a radical. He's a liberal. He's not a rabble-rouser. And he understands that the Arechigas are going to have to leave Chavez Ravine because there's a court order, because there's an eviction notice. You can't, it's the law. You can't flout the law, especially for Roybal as an elected official. But he has to try to negotiate this departure in a way that both sides will be happy with. The Arechigas have to be happy with it, and that's going to be very difficult, and the authorities have to be happy with it as well. And so he uses his negotiating skills, the fact that he does speak Spanish in a city where most of the people do not speak Spanish. He uses those skills to negotiate the Arechigas, to give them a way out, basically, because a lot of this is pride as well. One wonders whether the Arechigas, they said they wanted a fair price for their homes, and they certainly deserve that. But I wonder whether they would have wanted to leave under any circumstances, because Chavez Ravine was their home, and it was the kind of place that they didn't want to leave for any price. Roybal had to negotiate that somehow and get them to leave. The way he did it was, and this is classic for lawyers, he said, if you leave, you will preserve your rights, and everyone will stipulate to that. You can continue to fight them in court, but you have to leave, basically. You have to stand down. And they were willing to do that because I think the Arechigas were willing to do that at this point because the 11 homes or 11 other homes revelations had just come out, and I think they realized that they were in a weak public relations position. But Roybal was able to negotiate adherence with the law and a departure from the land by the Arechigas in an atmosphere of dignity and respect. And I think that showed that Roybal had tremendous political skills, and it's not the reason that he was later elected to Congress, but I think it was certainly a factor in that. And I think it's I think his ability to compromise, his ability to defuse potentially violent and radical situations, I think was certainly something in his favor as he rose up the political ladder. This is probably someone who should have been governor of California at some point. It's sometimes you're born too early, sometimes you're born too late. My guess is that if Roybal had been 15 or 20 years younger, he would have been governor of California.
Wow, that is amazing. It's such an amazing story. The whole Dodger, stadium story is just because O'Malley has his vision of what the stadium's going to be. He has all these ideas. It's so idealistic. But, and I think I mentioned to you this, he was a lawyer in New York. He's not ignorant of all this stuff. But when I read your book, this guy is just hopeful. It's like he came to California and stepped right into the fire.
Yeah, it's like so many people come to California with all these hopes and hopes and dreams and then they come there and they see how the city and the area actually works and they don't know. By our standards, O'Malley didn't do very much homework before he decided to move to Los Angeles. As I think we mentioned earlier, he hadn't even met in person most of the people that he was dealing with. Rosalind Wyman, who was pretty much his main contact, she was a city councilwoman in Los Angeles and one of the prime movers behind the getting the Dodgers. He had talked to her on the phone, but he had never actually met her, I don't think, until he got to Los Angeles. So, in many ways, I once heard that there's a Japanese proverb that sometimes you have to jump with your eyes closed. In other words, you have to just sort of take your chances. And I think to an extent that's what O'Malley ended up doing. He had not heard of the referendum mechanism. He didn't know about any, which you don't really have in New York, and you certainly do in California. Hadn't heard that he was going to be sued by a taxpayer group. I hadn't heard about that. And he really didn't even have any idea of the Arechigas, at least as he flew over the land. In May 1957, as he flew over the Chavez Ravine land, nobody told him, oh, by the way, there are still a number of Mexican-American families who are living in the Chavez Ravine who are going to have to be evicted and probably evicted with force. Nobody told him that either, and he only found that out when he got there. Sometimes you got to jump with your eyes closed.
No, that's true. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you about today, because I want to save O'Malley's vision for Dodger Stadium, because again, when you think of the time period, but this is still the early 60s,
right.
Things were happening back in New York. The Giants had moved from the Polo Grounds to Yankee Stadium. We have the AFL now coming, the American Football League coming in the early 60s, and now the owners are getting together in baseball and football and creating these concrete, cold, rotund stadiums which will be shared by both baseball and football. And we'll get into that next time. We'll see how Dodger Stadium was an architectural masterpiece.
Absolutely, and is so different, and the reason that those concrete monstrosities are virtually all gone. Probably the last one is the Oakland Coliseum, and its days I'm sure are numbered as well. The fact that the reason that all those other stadiums are gone and Dodger Stadium endures is that Dodger Stadium was built specifically for baseball by a baseball man. It was not built for football, as we'll see, and it makes all the difference in the world.
And we'll find that out next show. I want to save it for next show. Private gain, public good. We spoke about the business of, Los Angeles. Why this part of the book? We're nearing the last quarter of your book, and now we're talking about finances again. What's going on here?
Well, it's a private stadium. It's not a public stadium. So O'Malley, having now obtained the land, or obtained most of the land, is now pretty much on his own. That's the deal. The city of Los Angeles basically says, we're going to arrange for you to get this land, and after that, we're walking away. You are building your stadium. You are financing it as you see fit, and that's it. And in 1959, it becomes clear, okay, now it's time to build a stadium. The land has basically been cleared. There are basically two things that O'Malley has to do. First, he has to get more land. The city is so embarrassed by the Arechiga controversy that they really stop the eminent domain proceedings against. They've gotten him most of the land, but not all of it. And in the end, O'Malley has to go out and buy the extra land himself from landowners who would if he doesn't buy them out, they would be like islands in the Dodger Stadium parking lot. And of course, when a landowner knows you must have their land or else your project is dead, the price has a tendency to go up. So he ends up spending something like, I think, $500,000 to buy properties that are valued total at like $60,000. Like he pays like a times 10 upgrade in terms of what he has to pay. So that's what he does, and he also has to find a way to get financing. And the banks, as you'd think, they want to finance Dodger Stadium. The banks are reluctant to finance Dodger Stadium because if you're a bank and you're making a loan, you've got to figure out is this loan going to be paid back? And one of the ways you do that is you compare it to other projects. Here's a man who wants to build a steel mill. Well, let's take a look. Have we lent money to steel mills in the past, and have they been paid back? Well, Dodger Stadium is a pretty unique project. So the banks have nothing to compare it to, or very little to compare it to. So they're rather skittish in terms of the financing. So where is he going to get the money? Well, he ends up getting the money in a very interesting way. He makes a deal with Union Oil Company, which is a big oil company. They want to get into sports. They want their name associated with sports because it's great public relations for them. And he strikes a deal with Union Oil where he basically sells them all the advertising rights for the stadium when it's built, and advertising rights on his radio broadcasts. And basically he makes Union Oil, the official sponsor of the L.A. Dodgers. And in this era of multiple sponsors, it's an interesting arrangement because it's for many years the only advertisements that were in Dodger Stadium were for Union Oil. Older Dodger fans probably remember this from the 60s and 70s, maybe even into the 80s. The only ads were at Union Oil. And in exchange for this, he basically gets what we would call an interest-free loan. He gets sort of an advance on those payments, and they're the equivalent of an interest-free loan. And he is then able to pay back this equivalent of interest-free loan after the stadium opens in 1962, when the revenues start flowing in. Then he's able to sort of pay this off. But he needs the money up front to build the stadium in 1959 and 1960, and he gets that money not from the banks, although the banks come through in the end also. Once Union Oil jumps in, the banks jump in also. But his original financing was not with a bank, but with an oil company. And there's even a Union Oil gas station in the Dodger Stadium parking lot. That's part of the deal also. They will have a gas station there for the fans who want to fill up before they go home. So Union Oil is really the lifesaver for Walter O'Malley, because without them, I don't think the banks come through at all, and he may have to get very creative in terms of his financing. So, Walter O'Malley, after he signs the deal with Union Oil, he's going to get his stadium built, at least he thinks, but he's also going to be in debt until he pays them off. And that takes a while, but he does.
That's just amazing. And, people today, we look at Dodger Stadium, and, a lot of us say, well, some? That's one of the older stadiums.
It is, except for Wrigley Fenway.
Yeah, it's the third longest. And we're sitting here talking about like it's been built yesterday, which pretty much it was. But you know what? Dodger Stadium has stood the test of time with all those concrete, cold stadiums. I remember going to Shea. I remember going to.
Yeah, I mean, as an old Met fan, I spent a lot of time at Shea, and all I can say about it is it's not Dodger Stadium.
Yeah, and I spent time at Veterans Stadium.
Yeah, I was there too.
Philadelphia, and those were all lookalikes. I never made it down to St. Louis or Pittsburgh, but I hear.
Well, I was in Pittsburgh, and I'll tell you a quick story about Pittsburgh, which still horrifies me. If you've been to the city of Pittsburgh, it really is a beautiful city with three rivers converging in the downtown area. Three Rivers Stadium, which was the concrete hulk that the Steelers and Pirates played in. I went to a game there, and if you can believe this, it's right on the confluence of those three rivers. But the stadium is built in a way that you can't even see the river. It's built away from the river, and there's like basically a concrete wall, the wall of the upper stadium, between you as a spectator and the river. You can't even see it. And I remember when I went to the one game that I'd been to at that stadium, I just couldn't believe that an architect would cut you off from the river. from those three rivers and the bridges, and again, anyone who's been to Pittsburgh, there are nice bridges that go across the rivers. You don't see any of those things. Now, in their new stadium or newer stadium, they didn't make that mistake, and you can see all of that. But old Three Rivers Stadium was this concrete bowl that provided no view at all, basically, especially of those rivers. And Dodger Stadium is the opposite of that. And I think in many ways, even though these retro stadiums, Dodger Stadium is a modernist stadium and not a retro one, these retro stadiums, Camden Yards and the others, and the Pittsburgh Stadium as well, borrow a lot from the modernist Dodger Stadium.
It's fantastic. It's a fantastic story. I'm going to give you another shout out to again, and we're going to do the building of Dodger Stadium. Hold the line, folks. First of all, congratulations, Professor Podair. Great job. I'm rooting for you. Let's hope you're in a long list with a lot of the good names. Very scholarly book. Love talking to you about it. Can hang the line, folks. If you haven't already, go out, get the City of Dreams, Dodger Stadium, and the Birth of Mine, Los Angeles. It is the most complete, most well-researched book on the subject. I learn something new every time I crack it open, and I've already read it once. And when I do the shows with Professor Podair, I have a great time. I learn a lot. I know you folks do too. And that's how we're going to sign off today. On behalf of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and in the immortal words of one of my radio and television broadcasting heroes, Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.